Hello once again, everyone. So I wanted to kind of go over something that was on my mind recently and just kind of pontificate on for a bit. And joining me for this conversation is Randy. So the idea here is let's talk a little bit about head movement in regards to historical fencing, though also presumably in regards to modern fencing. But essentially, where does it come up? Does it matter? Is it something you should be thinking about? So first off, let's define what head movement is other than just moving your head. Head movement is to be thought of as the active placement of your head into certain places. For example, the place you'll most often see it in regards to where it's referred to is the idea of, in a striking art, moving your head so as not to be hit. Though head movement can also lead into setups based upon whatever you're doing. So keeping the head as a mobile target, making it harder to hit, weaving it in out of the way, and putting it where you need to actively. This same idea definitely applies into sword. And so we're just gonna mention some instances of it. So first off, let's talk about when would this come up? What's the time you're gonna use it the most? So the place it is kind of first really mentioned, at least as far as historical texts, is when you're going to be looking at the rapier. Specifically, Capaferro makes a lot of mention of it, Fabris makes mention of it, etc. It's the idea of inclining your head to a certain direction as part of your motion. So for example, if I am going to thrust into quarta, if I stay completely still, my bell guard does protect me, but I could be a little bit safer by inclining my head toward my right, or if I'm thrusting into secunda, inclining my head to my left. Now, what you want to watch out for is that I am not leaning away. I'm leaning in, just I'm taking what would be upright posture and pushing myself a little to the side to give a bit more lateral posture one way or the other. This can be useful in two instances. Number one, since you're fighting centrally and you've only got one arm and your core out there, this slight turn one way or the other is adding some more power to it, some more core to it. And certainly in regards to the transition from one to the other, which is something I'll often do, my head will come over as part of that, almost like I'm sort of throwing one ear forward as I push my shoulder forward. We'll come back to that idea again in a moment. And so you see this happen, and also in regards to a defensive context, that's just me further away from the sharp thing. Since I'm not going to be stepping out, I might as well give myself a little bit of room to make myself safer. So that's kind of the first context it comes up in, though you will also see it mentioned in regards to inclining your body to one side or the other. We'll come back to that again in a moment. So, that makes total sense in rapier, since it's a very linear thrust-based game for the most part. But what about something like Longsword, which, let's be honest, is a little more popular and more widely practiced? In this, it also matters, right? And it's something you're probably doing without thinking about, and you probably feel it when it does happen, and it's the idea of being behind your cut. So what I mean here is that when you cut, you'll feel it pretty quick if you cut disconnected from yourself. For example, in this case, I'm just going to do a simple passing step cut from my right. If I'm not behind it, that just feels awful. Your cut angle gets wider. Usually your hands aren't connected to your core, so your cut gets shorter, or on the other side, longer, so you can't control it, and there's no energy in your step. Versus if when I cut, I put myself behind my sword, and specifically behind that part of my hands as they push the sword forward, this will start to activate. I'm throwing that shoulder, that foot, and that head behind the strike. Now, if we're talking about just cutting the air, I don't necessarily move all that much, but when we start swinging against opponents, definitely there is a little bit of inclination going on. So what I mean here is, let's have Randy just stand in any sort of opening here, right? When I strike in, sure, I can remain perfectly upright with him. This doesn't necessarily feel all that safe though, right? So we'll go ahead and have Randy parry in the middle line when I throw this cut, right? If I stay perfectly upright, I'm pretty much just giving him my flat, right? Now, don't be wrong, he is the one who's getting to set the stage, so there is some advantage on his part, but let's see what happens when I add just a little bit of, not too much, just a little bit of inclination with my step. And no, I'm not really changing my step itself, anything more than just adding that into it. So, now I cut in. Because this side is coming forward a little bit more and inclining against it, I get a lot more lateral pressure. Yes, he still stops me from hitting him, but we're in a much better middle bind that I can fight from, whereas before I was decidedly not doing so great. Now, could this be interpreted as just lateral stepping? Yeah, sure. But the way you're going to achieve that lateral stepping without, missing him entirely is by keeping your eye on him quite literally, which also moves the head. So that's kind of a situation where you're probably doing it, you just maybe don't think about it all that much. And in particular, if you're cutting out of a guard that is not one apt for cutting, so for example, stop me if you've heard this one before, somebody's standing in a point forward guard and tries to cut out of it, not generally a good idea. If you do this and your head isn't behind it in any way, shape, or form, this is not going to be a good cut. Maybe it can tag arms, but it's really not all that great. If I need to use this, particularly in the parry context, adding that head into it as soon as it enters into 0G can make a big difference. So we'll go ahead and have Randy attacking me against this. Right? Bringing that ear forward, that body forward, makes what would be a pretty weak parry into something a lot stronger because I am, visual, core, and then the arm's doing the thing. Helps a lot. So that's an instance where you're probably doing it more than you think. Another would be on the thrust, but we already talked about that. Now let's talk about in regards to the more common ways you see it, i.e. the not so great times. So, probably the most common thing that you're going to see, especially when you start off with, is people's heads moving outside of their bodies. And I cannot fault them. So, for example, cut comes in against me, this. Now, I can't blame people, especially if you're new to it or you don't have anything on your head, you want to get out of there. However, this head movement doesn't help you because while this can flee and get safe, this can't. So now let's take that idea of alignment that we were just talking about and apply it to that situation, right? So now I know I need to jerk my head backwards because Randy's going to get a lot closer than I want him to. But I keep things attached and force more of my leg back. And this can come with practice because while I am going backwards, I'm also adding a little bit of inclination. Another example of this would be lateral. And this is where you're going to see a lot more head movement. So for example, we'll have Randy throw a cut. Go ahead and throw a nice 45 here, right? You'll also see people do this sort of thing, where they lean their head dramatically to one side and do a relatively desperate rock. We've all been there, right? It happens. Again, if I attach my head just a little bit more to my core, even if I have to be desperate, and my footwork is sloppy, right? I can get a lot more out of this. Sure, this was a straight up block, right? Nothing good came out of this. Randy's going to attack me again. But I have a lot more time to deal with what's coming because I was lined up. And this it's not something that, just thinking about is magically going to make it happen, but you will start noticing it in other people. When you see them really jerk their head to the side and their legs and their feet aren't attached to them, this is time to keep hunting them, right? But if you can save yourself, it's like, oh, okay, I didn't move as bad as I thought, you might be able to stay in the fight a little longer than you believe. Now, another instance where you'll see it is just out and out dodging, right? This is pretty rare, though we just talked about it with the backsword, so I suppose now's a good time for it to come up. The idea of voiding just your head. Now, we void our arms, we void our body, we void our legs pretty much all the time. In fact, the head is probably the thing we void the least in regards to just it moving. In regards to the whole body moving, that's pretty common, right? For example, I'm in a nice open position, Randy cuts for me, I void by going through distance, maybe a sword passes, maybe it doesn't matter, that's all the same idea. But that's not just the head. There have definitely been instances where I've been fighting where I have voided just my head. Example of this would be, for example, one that came up not too long ago. We were out in point forward guard, I managed to tag someone's hand, and then as I was retreating, they really followed me, so I went ahead and got my head out of the way. Just because they were going for that target. I was already on my way out and I was leaving. A little bit of extra reassurance. Another instance where I've had it happen is against the thrust, wherein I found myself in position, we'll go to the high line, right? High thrusting line, there we go. A point has been coming in, and as part of me getting this parry, I have dodged to get it myself a little bit more angle like we've talked about before. These are things you can't necessarily train, but certainly you will find them appear a little bit more the more you start keeping things connected, and just the more you're aware of your opponent's blade. I find they come up a lot in playing with Dosek in particular. I'm talking about the short ones, because you have to be so close. But, either way, that's kind of the bad / getting to okay-ish realm of head movement. Let's also talk about the idea of head movement as a deceptive tool. So, and for this, I'm also going to go ahead and pick up the message. We do have some instances throughout a couple different fighting systems wherein they talk about the idea of using your head as a deceptive thing. So most times when we talk about deceit, we're always talking about what the blade is doing, because if they're watching our sword, we can lie to them. We talk about what our feet are doing, because you can be very, very subtle in where your weight is actually going and how you're going to spring, but we don't necessarily always talk about what the face, specifically the face and the head, are doing. And this is because we fence in masks, right? There's a reason some people paint their masks, right? Myself included. But that's going to be a much bigger part of fencing than you would expect if you've never fenced without a mask before. Not that I'm advocating for you to do that, but point being, when there's no barrier, you learn a lot more about the person because they can't hide it, right? Very few people have a good poker face when they're fencing with swords, right? But this is a two-way street. It's not just about receiving information, it's also about what information you give out. And if you're clever about things, you can start lying to your opponent with various types of head movement in particular. So, what I'm going to go off of here is one that I recently read in the Polar Messer section, which also does appear in some backsword manuals, and that's the idea of cocking the head in relation to where you're cutting. So, for example, we'll just go ahead and have Randy give me an opening on his left side. So, if I were to throw a blow in against his side, there's a couple different things I could do. Number one is if I'm looking to get him to cover that opening and set up for something else, then what I can do is I can twitch with the tip and with the head. So for example, Randy may be someone who doesn't bite when I just turn my blade, but he may be someone that bites when I start inclining my body toward that direction. This is one you see a lot more in backsword, which is a bit strange to do with Messer, but either way, the idea of twitching to get him to start responding to it. And you can even mess around with that, right? Seeing those little bits of engagement. You also see the same with rapier in regards to the extension, and you can line up in that regard. That's one instance where I'm essentially feinting with my head. Another example is just outright lying with your head, and this one's a little bit trickier to do. So, we'll look into this instance again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to incline my head toward my right to get him believing that I'm about to bite on that, but then throw out of my left. This is one in, like I said, the Kohler manuscript that is referred to as the eye cocker, or sometimes also referred to as the squinter, depends upon your exact translation. But the idea here is that if I want to throw from my right, I incline my head to my left. If I want to throw from my left, I incline my head to my right, and just basically throw the opposite. Because I've gotten him tuned in to looking for this as a source of engagement, and then this can go wherever it needs to. Now, is that something that you can use immediately? Actually, yes. And we'll go back to the longsword for this, because this is one I actually do quite a lot of. Especially if I am fighting against a left-handed person, but I will still do it against righties, especially if they give me an opening on that side. What I will do is I'll step up and I'll go into a right guard, and what I will do is I'll do a small advance and incline my head over to the right in some way. So this, just to get them starting to move, then you just pop it out real tight to the shoulder. This is essentially the same play we just talked about, but applied now with the longsword. Here's that one more time. I'm up at the shoulder, twitch, go. Nothing really out of the ordinary, but it is still in the category of head movement. Every part of you gives information. Every movement, every parry, every thought in theory that goes through your head, he might pick up on because he's paying attention to you and you alone. Why not lie to him, right? So start seeing if you maybe have some instances in which you can use your own physical tells, in particular your head, to maybe start lying to them. Most people will listen to hands. They'll listen to where you are, and the place I usually look is right in the center of a person for this exact reason. I'm looking for that engagement. If you can trick someone by getting them tuned in and changing it up, it's going to be pretty hard for them to follow you until they adjust. And once they do adjust, that just means, great, now I can't believe anything I'm looking at, right? But either way, both in the offensive and defensive, as well as now, kind of between the two contexts, see if maybe that positioning of your head and your upper chest can't assist you in some ways. But thank you very, very much, Randy. And thank you all very much for watching. Hopefully you get some use of that. If you have any particular instances that you've used or that you're a fan of, by all means put them down in the comment. I love hearing other tricks. Either way, thank you much. We'll go over some other techniques another time.